The first thing I would say is when the founding fathers of this country declared independence, and then when they created the Constitution the following decade, the model around the world was basically that God would endow individual kings with power to govern, and then the king would use that power and dispense that around the kingdom as he saw fit. So it didn't mean that nobody had freedom. It just meant your freedom was really a courtesy of the monarch. So there were some people that were privileged, most people were not, and that was just kind of the way it was. Well, when they founded our country, they said, no, there's no divine right of kings. We're endowed by our Creator as individuals with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so the power is God endowed to the great body of the people. The purpose of government is to protect the rights that we already possess. And so when you see things like the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law abridging, establishing a religion, abridging the free exercise thereof, press, assembly, and the like. Just understand, you have the right to express yourself. You have the right to practice your faith, not because the First Amendment is giving you that right. Those are rights that you already have by the grace of God. The First Amendment is there to provide protections for that right against government intrusion. And so it's very important to understand where the source of your rights come in the American system, why the Founding Fathers believe that, and why our government is structured the way it is. Now, they looked around, and when they were creating the Constitution, they had studied every republic in the history of mankind because they wanted to draw lessons for what had been done before. And they noticed that if you looked at all of those different experiments where you had republics, they all had one thing in common. And the one thing in common was this: every one of them had failed. And so they view it really, it fell to the United States to determine whether people really could govern themselves. Could you have a government based on the consent of the governed, where people's God-given rights were protected, people had a voice in government, or was that just something that wasn't in the cards and we were all going to live under various forms of despotism? And that was really the question that they had to answer when they were creating the Constitution. And so in order to do that, I think that they looked at it, and I think this is true, you know, your rights can be abridged by an individual dictator. You know, you look like a Kim Jong-un or some of these people that rule with an iron fist. You look at the regime in Cuba, for example. They can just oppress you. They throw you in the gulag. That's one person, one tyrant. That's true. And they were concerned about that. I mean, they had just revolted against the King of England, so that was something that was important. But they also understood that your rights could be eroded by the tyranny of the majority. That just because a majority believes something, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's in the best interest of you. And so what they wanted to do was, yes, it had to rest on the consent of the governed. Yes, public sentiment ultimately would prevail, but what they didn't want is to kind of have mob rule, where you would have no constitutional protections, no checks and balances, and whatever you had public opinion on one instant, that's what would be the policy, and if that violated your rights, if you happen to be in the minority, then that would, and it could be a minority on a variety of different things. It could be on income, wealth, it could be on religion, ethnicity, race, anything. So that's what they were concerned about. So they created a system that divided the powers amongst three branches of government. So you had the legislature, which was the Congress, and the Florida's Constitution is similar. You had the executive. Here we have the governor, me, and then you have the president federally, and then a judiciary. And so we have a Supreme Court here in our state. You have a Supreme Court of the United States. And so each one of those branches had different functions. But more importantly than just that, which had kind of been accepted wisdom for people that believed in constitutional government at the time, they understood that just because you divide the powers, each branch is going to try to get as much power for itself. That's human nature. That's what they're going to try to do. So in order to make sure you have an equilibrium where there's not one power in government that's dominating all the rest, you need to have checks and balances. And so you have the Congress there's two houses of Congress. You have the House of Representatives, which is direct election from the individuals, and then the Senate, which is 2 senators from every state, regardless of how big it is. So Florida, we're the 3rd biggest state. We have the same number of senators, 2, as some of the smallest states, like Rhode Island and Wyoming and some of those. And they wanted that to be able to provide some internal checks within the legislative branch. Then you go to the executive, and the executive can veto legislation that the Congress were to pass. And so that's a check on legislative excesses. But the Congress had the power of the purse. So if you have a president or an executive going off the rails, the Congress can simply remove funding from those operations, and then the executive would not be able to function in that regard anymore. Then you had the courts, which they thought would play a more minor role, important but minor, but they didn't think the courts, they thought it would be the weakest of the 3 branches. In reality, I mean, you look over the last 50, 60, 70 years, the courts, federal courts, have taken a lot of power. They've redefined, basic things in society. They've done things where they've really been legislating, and there's not really much of a check on that. And so the founders, I don't think they necessarily saw it going in that direction, but that's a battle that we fight. What's the proper role of the judiciary? And my view is the judiciary applies the law. It applies the Constitution. If you guys are legislators and you pass something that the judges don't like, they have no authority to strike it down unless it offends the Constitution. They have to apply it reasonably. They can't redefine terms that the legislature put in. But that system, the design of it, is to protect individual freedom, because if no one branch can get a huge amount of power, then it kind of created an equilibrium. So the legislature would want to go, executive can bat them back, the courts could be a check, and that's how the system did. They actually didn't do a Bill of Rights when they first did the Constitution. The Bill of Rights were passed in 1791 after you had the government launched. And the reason they didn't do the Bill of Rights initially is say, hey, this is a limited government anyways. It only has certain powers, so you're going to list the rights, but that assumes that Congress could infringe any of these things, which we haven't given authority to do. A lot of the Anti-Federalists weren't satisfied with that, so they wanted the Bill of Rights. So that's where you got, First Amendment, Second Amendment, all the way down there. Then in the Civil War, you got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, which many of the founders wanted to get rid of at the time, but you had some that wanted it because of, where they were from. And so Lincoln always said, look, I just read the Declaration of Independence. It says all men are created equal. That's what we need to have in our society. And so that was, obviously, with the Civil War, led to the 13th Amendment. Then the 14th Amendment was designed to make sure that basic rights were protected against state intrusion. So there was a concern that, you could just have state legislatures run roughshod over the rights of individuals, and so there are certain protections there of due process and equal protection that they thought was important. And then the 15th Amendment was to protect a vote. Then you had other amendments as we went on, but I think they understood that you needed to provide a mechanism to be able to amend the Constitution, but they didn't want it to be easy where it would just happen every other year. They wanted it to be something that was really significant. So in the history of our country, there's only been one amendment that was enacted and then that was later revoked. Do you guys know which one that was? Which one? See, that was not even a question, So they did the prohibition, and there was a lot of concern at the time about the role that alcohol was playing in society. A lot of the Christian groups were very much supportive of doing that. So they did it, and the problem is that, it developed a huge black market for this, speakeasies, all this other thing. So it ended up being revoked, and that's just there. Now, when I look at how to structure a government, I think the founders' basic insights are the best insights that anyone's made yet. The one thing that I think that I wish they would have done, and they considered this, but I wish they would have put term limits for members of Congress. And the reason why, The reason why, so at the time they were thinking about it, and they called it rotation in office, and they were thinking, they're like, I don't even know if people would want to serve. I mean, like, just think about it. They didn't have modern transportation. So you're going to get on a horse from South Carolina, and at the time it was Philadelphia, then New York, and then eventually it was Washington, D.C. But are you going to want to get on a horse and go back and forth to there? I mean, like, some would do it, but do you really want to do that for 30, 40 years? So I don't think that they really conceived of kind of this idea of somebody being in Congress for decades and decades. But what's happened, particularly in the last 50, 60 years, is, people get in there, and their number one goal isn't to do great things for the district or the country. I think some of them want to do those things, but their number one prerogative is to get reelected. And so that takes precedent over anything. So you end up with a situation where you've got a lot of these people in very high levels of the Congress who are in their 70s and 80s. And look, not that there's anything wrong with that, but they've been in Congress for 30 or 40 years. And I think they're very out of touch with what's going on in this country. That's one of the reasons why Congress is not well regarded as an institution. But the incentives are not to do the big things that really matter. Whereas I think if you had term limits, it's like, okay, you work hard to get elected. Say you get 3 two-year terms in the House. Okay, well, what are you going to have to show for it? People are going to have an incentive to really want to get some stuff done. We have term limits here in the legislature in Florida. It's a much better system than what they have in Washington. So you have 4 two-year terms in the House and 2 4-year terms in the Senate, and that's all you can do. So someone gets elected in the House, they immediately work to see who's going to be the speaker for that class. So every 2 years there's a new speaker. Every 2 years there's a new Senate leader. What I think that incentivizes is it incentivizes the leaders of the legislature to say, okay, I've got a 2-year window. I want to be able to leave a legacy. I want to be able to advance my key priorities. And whether that politically is good or not is not their number one concern, because they're not going to be in that position after 2 years. And so if you look at how productive we've been in Florida, not just since I've been governor. I mean, we've had other productive times, but certainly since I've been governor, we've been more productive, I think, than any time in the history of the state, and more productive than any other state around the country. But part of the reason we're able to do that, I think, is because you got the leaders come in, they know the end of the ramp. No question about that. So let's get things done. And we've been able to get a lot done. And my view is, when you deal with the legislature, is, I want them to be successful, particularly the leadership, on their priorities. It's got to be within reason. I mean, I'm not going to go out against some of my stated positions, and we got to make sure we're continuing to go in the right direction. But there's certain things that are important to them. I want to be supportive, and obviously we want them to support our agenda, but it's so much better to be able to do that. The other thing that you would, I think, in Washington that we have in Florida is we have a requirement to balance the budget every year. And if we have situations where we have a shortfall, then the legislature has to come in and they have to make adjustments about what they're doing. In Washington, the path of least resistance is just to charge it on the credit card. And that's what they do. I mean, just the last, 2 years, we've gone from 21 trillion to 30 trillion in debt. The first 200 years of our country, I think we had 4 or 5 trillion in debt, and then now we're doing massive, unfathomable amounts. And the reason is there's just no incentive to ever make a choice. If you're a member of Congress, politically, the easiest thing for you to do is to charge it on the credit card. If you raise people's taxes, and I'm not advocating that, but they don't like that, and so some of them are going to want to vote you out. If you reduce spending, well, the spending has constituencies. I mean, maybe there's a military program, maybe there's this, maybe there's that. Some people may not like that. So it requires them to make difficult choices. But, when COVID hit Florida and hit the country in 2020, we actually were right in the middle of the legislative session. It started January 2020. Remember, back then, Fauci was saying, this is not a big deal. The media was saying, worry more about the flu. So that's what's happening in February of 2020. as we get into March. So they're working on the budget, they're doing this. And then right as the budget became due is when you started to see a lot of the craziness where professional sports leagues were stopping, theme parks, all this other stuff. So I have this budget on the desk, which really was reflective of a reality in which the economy was going to continue to be strong and it was not necessarily going to be deterred with COVID, to now in a situation where, you know, my tourism industry is in jeopardy. I have all these issues. And so we took the budget. It wasn't due till July 1st. I waited till the end of June. And when we vetoed what was then a record $1 billion in vetoes. And there were things that were really good in there that I vetoed, but I just made the point that, look, we can't have a shortfall. We need to make sure that we're making the ends meet here. The fiscal, the creditworthiness of state, all that's very, very important. So that was the right thing to do. It turned out, because we were open, you know, you started to see that revenue really, really pick up. And we've had massive amounts of revenue pouring in because of all the economic activity. But that is just the reality of what you have to do. If Washington, if they were forced to do that, you know, I think you'd see them make a lot of different decisions, and it would not necessarily be mortgaging the future of the next generation. You know, I will say this, when I was your age, people talked about the national debt. I was a congressman for 3 terms. We talked about it. We tried to, at least I was trying to do something about it. And there was always predictions of doom that, well, if we go another $1 trillion in debt, there's going to be doom. And I would accept those. But I think it's because we've done so much debt over the last 20 years, and you have not necessarily had a debt crisis that I think people just assume, well, you can just go ahead and keep doing this. I don't think that that's ultimately going to be the case. I mean, I think eventually you got to pay the piper. And if it was just a matter of just charging everything on a credit card, well, heck, let's just charge another $5 trillion, right? I mean, like, if that's were the case. But I don't think that's how it works. So eventually, I think there's going to be a reckoning on this. I can't tell you when. If you would have told me 10 years ago that we may go to 30 trillion, I would have said no way. I would have said that would have been a huge, huge problem. But yet here we are. But having some type of requirement to make sure that these legislators have to make tough decisions, I think is important. I think term limits would help too, because they wouldn't be so concerned about being reelected. But those are two things structurally that I think are very, very important. And the one thing I would just say in terms of leadership, and when I became governor, I did two things really, I think, made two decisions. The first was I just had my transition folks give me a list of all the powers of the governor, the constitutional powers, statutory powers, customary powers. What could I do on my own? What did I need the legislature for? What could I do with just maybe upholding with a third of the legislature? What role would the courts have to check? What did I, and just really get a good idea of that. And I knew most of it, but just every little nook and cranny I wanted to know. And then when you're trying to pursue an agenda, you've got to be cognizant of where all these pressure points are within the system. And so if I'm trying to do something with, school funding, well, I can't do that on my own. I need to get the legislature on board for that. If I'm doing something with like an appointment, well, I may be able to do that on my own. There may be other things I can do on my own. So we had kind of a good sense of how we needed to advance the agenda through the various wickets and constraints to be able to actually deliver on our promises. And we were able to do that. I mean, if you look back, politicians overpromise and underdeliver. That's typically what they do. In Florida, we set a high bar, and a lot of people didn't think we'd meet it. We have sailed past the bar that we set. We've done much more than even I promised and even what people thought was possible. But part of the reason is I think we had a good sense of where we were going. The other thing we made the decision on is, I became governor. I'm like, you know what? I'm not doing polling. I'm not going to be one of these politicians that just has the finger in the wind, that's so worried about kind of this or that. You got to do what's right. And, responding to polls is being a follower. That's not being a leader. A leader will set out a vision, will execute on that vision, and then when the results are positive, you know what? People will be with you when you do that. So I could take a poll of this room on whatever issue. That's just a static analysis. That doesn't even tell me what I need to know. What I need to know is that if I embark on an initiative and I explain what I'm doing and I'm successful in doing it, then what would the results be in the room? And so I think too many politicians, they get paralyzed with these polls, and they're so concerned about every little thing in a news cycle. That's not the way I think a leader operates. The leader needs to understand where true north is. Have you guys seen Top Gun Maverick? The Navy, we always know where true north is. These ships are out there. You got these, you got these planes landing on the carrier, the jets. I mean, it's really, really impressive. But, the seas are not always calm. There's choppy seas. There's a lot of things that happen, on the voyage. But if you have that rudder set and you know where you're going, that's ultimately the important thing, is whether you get to that ultimate destination. So whenever there's something in the news cycle or, phony controversy or whatever, just don't even indulge in that. There's no worry. So we always keep focused on what we're here to do and the things that actually matter to people, and we're not going to let little blips in public opinion. And I can tell you, some of the things we've done that have been most successful were not necessarily popular at the time. I mean, when we had the schools open, there were a lot of people that were not supportive of that. I mean, the parents mostly were supportive of it because they're like, I need to get the kids in school. But a lot of other people weren't. The media was very critical. Other folks, Fauci and these people, were criticizing us. But we had looked at the data. Other countries had this. It was not rocket science. And the cost of not having schooling and sports for kids. We had families move from some of these other states because their kids couldn't play football or basketball or some of these sports in 2020. And I'm like, why would you take away those opportunities for these kids that are so meaningful? So we were able to do that. It was not something that was popular. We got hammered for it. But you know what? Now people look back. Nobody wants to admit that they opposed me on keeping schools open. They won't admit that. They'll say, oh, no, we were really for it. That was not true. It was not true at the time, but nevertheless. And so that's an example of just doing what's right, let the chips fall where they may. But at the end of the day, with the politics of everything, I was totally fine with whatever political consequences were going to come. If I'm taking efforts to protect education for my folks, if I'm taking efforts to protect their jobs, that's more important to me than protecting my own job. And so how it shook out was how it was going to shake out. Now, it turns out people look and they're very happy that they had a governor standing up for them. But it was not necessarily, if I was going just on polling, probably would have made a lot of different decisions along the way. And those decisions invariably would have been much worse for the state of Florida. So just understand, if you're in this realm, what we really need in our state and in our country in greater quantities, we need leadership. We need people that have some courage, the courage of your convictions. And when you stand up for the right things, the way our society is right now, you got media that's very dishonest about what they do. They have their agenda, big tech. You got a lot of stuff. They're trying to always advance their narrative. I'd be very weary of any of those narratives when they're trying to shove it down your throat. But nevertheless, that's just the reality. So when you're standing up on principle, when you're standing up for what's right, man, people will come after you in this realm. I'm telling you, that's just the reality. And it's not just people like me as governor. It's talking about people, parents going to school board meetings. It's talking about everything under the sun involving the future of our country. You will face some opposition for that. So none of this is cost-free. But if people aren't willing to stand up and take those arrows and pay the price to be able to do what's right, then we don't have much of a future. And so what I would tell you is, yes, understand government, learn about all this stuff, very important. But then as you go out beyond where you are now, just be willing to have the fortitude and the strength to stand up for what you believe in. And you know what? What people appreciate, if they see you standing on the wall for them, they see you take an incoming and you stand your ground and you support them, they will have your back. I mean, these folks will walk over broken glass to say thank you and to support you if you're standing up for them. And so that's what we've been able to see in the state of Florida. And I think that we need more people to understand that's really what leadership calls for right now in this day and age. And so I wish you guys luck with everything that you're doing. I have a great regard for our American Legion. We're very, very happy to be what I think is the #1 state for veterans in the entire United States. And we've got some great posts throughout this state. We have a lot of great active duty military installations where so I was in the Navy. Anybody that I knew in the Navy, the minute they got stationed in Florida, they would establish Florida residency. And, they move you around in the military every 2.5 years. And so you get to Mayport, you get to Pensacola, you get some of these places, you get the Florida driver's license, you register to vote, you do a homestead on your property. They wouldn't give that up. They get sent to Bremerton, Washington. They're Florida residents. They get sent to North Island and San Diego. They're Florida residents. Norfolk, they're still Florida residents. So most of these folks, once they've been here on active duty, the chance that they end up coming back and being Florida residents when they're discharged from active service is very, very high. And so we're happy that we are a very veteran-friendly state. We think that they offer an enormous amount to our communities, and we're going to keep on being supportive. But just enjoy it here and be thankful that you live in the one state that everyone wants to be a part of right now. So thank you all. God bless. Appreciate it. What do you want me?
And